everyone, and welcome to Books in the World. Today we have a very wonderful program about the history of theater on Cape Cod. And we are with Sue Mellen, who has written this very comprehensive and delightful book about the history of Cape Cod theater, which goes back just almost 100 years. Welcome, Sue. So glad to meet you.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here, Madeline. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. As we've been talking about preparing for this interview, I've mentioned that the Cape Cod Writers Center started close to 60 years ago. And in reading about the history of theater, I made some parallels in my mind about the fact that artists and writers and painters just collaborated and worked together and just had these little hives of creativity all over the Cape. So I enjoyed hearing about the theater. So, Sue, I'm going to introduce you a little farther. You started your writing career as a feature writer for the Cape Cod Times. So you must have learned about some of this firsthand.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And then you have, I guess you would say you're a professional writer. In addition to being an author, you describe a little bit about what you do when you're not writing books.
Sure. So I have a company called Your Writers, and it is basically an online writers agency / small publishing company. So what we do is we work with freelance and contract writers from all over the country, and in fact have worked with writers around the world. And we write for companies, corporations, associations, thought leaders, and we've done, I would say 20 books as a part of the company, and that's often ghostwriting or co-writing or serious editing for CEOs and about leaders.
Great to know. I think that people who don't know that your company exists and that perhaps others like this can flock right to your website, and we'll be giving yourwriters.com a little credit line. And I think that it is a very interesting venture. Now, the history of the theater on Cape Cod, back to that, I have to say I was looking at some of the reviews on your website or Amazon, and I had to just read this one. It says, a history of theater on Cape Cod is so thoroughly researched and accessible. Reading it, one can feel the sand between the boards. Love it. I just love it. It gave me such a deep appreciation for the roots of the theater, a reverie of what came before. We stand on the shoulders of passionate giants. So,
absolutely.
Don't you love it? And I'm sure I'm sure you know the writer, Nina Schuessler, producing artistic director, Cape Cod.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. That's a wonderful theater company.
Good.
Company. And they've been around 70 years.
Oh my.
They used to be the Harwich Junior Theater and recently became the Cape Cod Theater Company. And for 70 years, they've been training young children and producing a whole variety of productions every year.
Oh, good. I'm glad we had a chance to mention that right off. So writing a book is such a huge undertaking. What led you to? What was it about the theater in Cape Cod that made you want to take this on?
Well, it's just such a dramatic story. It's an epic, really, the history of theater in Cape Cod. It begins at the end of the 19th century and the very beginning of the 20th century. And there's a key moment that you and I have discussed, which was the production of a little play called Bound East for Cardiff. And that was by Eugene O'Neill, happened in Provincetown as part of a little vanguard of artists and actors and directors called the Provincetown Players. And that moment transformed American drama as we know it. And I don't think many people know that. I mean, that was the very beginning of an interpretation of drama as a uniquely American art form.
So,
And I was so thrilled when I discovered that I needed to write the book.
yeah, that very comment got me thinking, and I have somewhat of I have a liberal arts background with some knowledge of theater. I was actually a Shakespeare major. I don't know if there was such a thing, but you mentioned that before this time, the theater was more or less adapted from European theater. And
Right.
that was, and I suppose, if you think about it, historical drama, music, operetta, maybe.
Yeah,
Um,
operetta, certainly.
and
Right.
you come to O'Neill and others, which we'll talk about. We're talking about psychology and emotion and
Yeah,
family
absolutely.
problems.
And class issues that
Yeah,
was another thing that the
class issues.
Provincetown players dealt with that hadn't been dealt with before. And that was really unique. And that's one of the things
That's
that sets
interesting. Yeah.
American drama apart.
Class issues. Okay. So they were gathered in Provincetown primarily. Tell us a little about the charming stories about the first productions on the wharf
Oh
theater.
yes, yes. Well, yeah. The Bound East and a number of productions in the summer of 1916 were produced in what was originally an old fish house. And this was a building owned by Mary Vorse and Mary Heaton Vorse. And she actually donated this building to the Provincetown Players, to what at that time, actually, they weren't even called the Provincetown Players. It was just a little vanguard of artists and actors and directors. And until that time, they actually produced plays, their own plays, in their own homes. So finally, they had this little fish house from Mary Heaton Vorse on what is now Lewis Wharf in Provincetown. And they produced Bound East for Cardiff and a number of other productions that summer of 1916. And there's actually a wonderful story about the opening night of Bound East. And it was pouring rain and there were thunderstorms. So the old fish house was actually shaking. And then later it shook with applause. So,
And you also say that I'm not sure it was the same production, but the back of the theater was open and that the sea was actually the backdrop. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
in fact, that's true. And in
Yeah.
fact, that was part of Bound East for Cardiff. And interestingly, a few years ago, I went to a production by Provincetown Dramatic Arts of Eugene O'Neill's Anna Christie. And they actually did that. They opened the huge doors onto the sea. And so you could really see that it was a godlike presence,
Yeah.
that,
Godlike
that,
presence. Oh
that
my.
the sea was omnipresent.
Wow. So they moved to the Barnstormer Theater after they either outgrew or it fell down or they just needed to expand. Tell us a little bit about that part of the history.
Well, actually, the early Wharf Theater was swept away by a storm in 1922. And so at that point, yes, a bookseller and sometime playwright, sometime actor, Frank Shea, who had a wonderful bookstore in Greenwich Village. And in fact, it's part of Greenwich Village history. But that attracted a lot of revolutionaries and new artists and playwrights. And he and his wife came to Provincetown and settled here. And they had a property with a barn. So he donated the barn to the Provincetown, what were then the Provincetown Players, who became the Barnstormers at that point.
Well, I read in some publicity about Provincetown that there are some people who think Paul Robeson played on that stage in the play Emperor Jones, Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones. It may not be true. But leading on to that subject, who are some of the names, the big names that some people, many people will remember today, who were involved in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond in that era?
Yeah. Sure. So there was a wonderful group in Falmouth, in fact, called the University Players. And that seemed to be an absolute bastion for what became luminaries. So Henry Fonda, Jimmy Stewart, Margaret Sullivan, and Joshua Logan, who was such a well-known producer and director on Broadway and in films. And in fact, he wrote in his autobiography about what it was like to be starving artists together in West Falmouth. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story.
We jumped over to Falmouth, but let's jump back to the story about Dennis. How did the people who were mostly in Provincetown expand and move out? So we're going to the Cape Playhouse.
Yeah. So the Provincetown Players and the groups around them, the artists and actors around them, did in fact in the 20s and 30s start moving outward. And one of the places that one of them went was Dennis. And that was Raymond Moore. And he had been a Provincetown player and had also acted with the Barnstormers. And he wanted and was doing some playwriting on his own. And what he wanted was to open a theater complex. From the very beginning, he had the idea of not just a theater, but a complex in the business district of Cape Cod, which was even then the sort of business, more populous area of Cape Cod. And so he found an old building, the Nubscusset Meeting House, which had been built in 1790. And he had that moved to a plot of land, a 3-acre plot in Dennis. And that was the beginning of what, for all of these years, for now almost 100 years, has been the art complex that houses the Cape Playhouse and the Cape Cinema and the Cape Museum of Art and a number of other buildings.
What a treasure! So that was that was in the what year again? Can you just go back?
Actually, 1927 was the first production at the Cape Playhouse. And that first production starred Basil Rathbone. Speaking of star power.
Speaking of that. So a couple of things I just want to remind people that part of why the Cape was so popular, two things, was the heat in New York that closed the theaters in the summer and the railroad. And, you know, they knew how to get up here. They took ferries and trains and they really loved coming. So we've talked a little bit about the Cape Playhouse without mentioning Richard Aldrich and his wife.
Gertrude Lawrence.
Yeah, and she's Mrs. A, and she sounds like a lively person and well known in acting for other things.
You think of The King and I.
The King and I, yeah. What year are we going? We're going back in now to the 40s, perhaps?
Yeah, late 30s. Yeah. Early 40s, right? And she actually became, well, for one thing, she was an incredible businesswoman. She had an incredible business mind. She was not just a great actress. But for instance, the what became the Melody Tent, which was originally the Cape Music Circus, was her idea.
Okay.
That was really, she had actually seen tent theaters in Florida, and so presented the idea to her husband, to Richard Aldrich, who eventually managed 4 theaters. He managed the Cape Playhouse, the Falmouth Playhouse, the Cape Music Circus / Melody Tent, and the South Shore Music Circus. And when she told him how successful these tent theaters had been in Florida, he decided to give it a try. And so that's how we got the Melody Tent.
Yeah, and it seats over 1,000 people, and it's a big adjustment from the little theaters that started in Provincetown.
Right.
I'm thinking about some of the efforts that he had something to do with at the Falmouth Playhouse. And what happened. Can you just briefly go over what happened then in Falmouth and where we are today?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So the Falmouth Playhouse was an absolute jewel in the crown of Cape Cod theater. And that was built in the early 30s. And it was this magnificent structure. No barns here. This is not a makeshift barn or a makeshift fishing house. This was a magnificent structure that had its own form of air conditioning back in the 30s and 40s, and had an oval European style bar, had a restaurant overlooking Coonamessett Lake, which is where it was located, on the banks of the Coonamessett. And what was just incredible. And that was a real magnet for stars. In fact, there's a great little piece of theater trivia, which is that Tallulah Bankhead actually christened the Falmouth Playhouse by smashing a champagne bottle on a prop.
Oh, goodness.
Well, that was the beginning of the Falmouth Playhouse.
A lot of anecdotes. I mean, I might just give you an opportunity to tell the one about Betty Davis, since we're talking about Tallulah Bankhead back at the Cape House.
Yeah, so Betty Davis and her mother came to the Cape, and she was looking to do some acting, and so went to the Cape Playhouse, which was operating at that time already and in full swing. And she couldn't get a part right away. So she got a job ushering at the Cape Playhouse and ushered for about a week, and then got a part in a play called Mr. Pym Stops By. Now, nobody will ever remember Mr. Pym Stops By, although I did see somebody producing it recently, which I thought was a riot. But actually, she got that part, and the play is forgettable, but she, of course, is unforgettable.
That's for sure. So bring us up a little bit up to date. We have over 24 theaters on the Cape. You have some statistics about the number of people who actually formed the audience before we had to have a hiatus in 2020, 2019, and a little bit about what's going on today, even perhaps starting with the Falmouth Highfield Hall and College Light Opera Company.
Sure. So, yes. So in a normal summer, 600,000 people see performances on Cape Cod, which is just amazing when you think about it, on this little spit of land of ours. So what's wonderful is that it's almost as if the pandemic never existed for some of these theater companies. They've got full schedules, and the College Light Opera Company is one of those at Highfield Hall in Falmouth. They have a full schedule beginning with The Pirates of Penzance on June 22nd, it was their opening night. And they always start with a Gilbert and Sullivan production because their roots were in the Gilbert and Sullivan Players way back when.
Well, and we don't want to overlook the Tennessee Williams Festival in Provincetown. And then, of course, there are lots of wonderful things on the Vineyard and Nantucket as well. Are they opening up as well?
They are. They are. On the Vineyard, in fact, they are well situated to deal with outdoor theater. They have an outdoor amphitheater where they have always performed, where they've performed for many years, and they've always done Shakespeare for the masses out there in their amphitheater, and so they will be doing a number of presentations there this year. And Harwich, in Harwich, the Cape Cod Theater Company, they're putting up a tent. So,
Great.
so they're
Great.
going to be performing outside.
Well,
So, and I know that Wellfleet Harbor Actors Theater, in fact, has a pretty full schedule themselves.
well,
So,
I, for one, after reading this book, am more anxious to check out some of these plays than I ever was. It just sounds wonderful. So let's talk about the writing process. This is a big job that you undertook. Well, no, what is it about your background that brought you to this place, and how did you find the discipline to do it?
I've almost always been a writer. My father was a writer and an editor. And so I've always felt very lucky that I always knew what I would be doing. As a child, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and that never quite happened, but I've come close, I think. So I knew that from the very beginning. And so very early on in the 1970s, I started working for the Cape Cod Times, writing theater reviews and features and features about the theater world and artists and craftspeople. So that was a very early start. And in terms of this writing project, I was just so compelled to write it that was so taken with the story that it just carried me through. That I would often start mornings at 7 o'clock, be at my computer, and then I would realize it was getting dark, and I would just be driven to write it.
Good for you. So I've discussed this with writers before. When you're writing history, you spend a lot of time researching, and you come to your desk with layers and piles of different materials. So how do you find the stories and then decide how to weave them together?
Well, I knew a lot of people in the theater world, so that was incredibly helpful, and I guess that really fits in. As I think you and I discussed, I've taught writing. I taught writing at Northern Essex Community College for a number of years. So what I always used to say is that you have to really know your subject, and so whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. And so I've really lived at the subject for a long time, did acting myself. So that really helped. And the fact that I knew people to begin with, was able to get in touch with them. And what happened, and I think what probably happens on any long look at history, is that there were a million different strings to pull. When I started researching, I would talk to someone and I thought I knew the story, for instance, of a particular theater company. And suddenly there would be dozens of other people and other strings and other directions that I knew I needed to go, which directed me to other theater companies that have long since closed, and to other people who are no longer involved. So
So I'm
following those
assuming
strings.
You had to leave out some material. Is that what we're saying? You had to be selective.
Yeah. Well, right. I could actually have written a huge volume,
Yeah,
but it did lead me to some of the great stories that I wanted to include in the book that I did include in the book,
right.
like the Fishermen's Players in Eastham. What a wonderful story that is. And I never knew anything about it. And someone directed me towards that. So
Yeah.
that
There are
was,
even things in your book that a lot of people wouldn't know that are probably a little more well known, like Kurt Vonnegut was quite involved. Cat's Cradle, and he was a resident of Barnstable and was involved with was it the Barnstable Comedy Club?
Barnstable Comedy Club. He was. In fact, he was a board member there for many years. But he was also very involved with the Academy of Performing Arts in Orleans.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time, and I want to be sure that you have a chance to talk about your presentations, and not only because I want everyone to go to them and that you use this time to talk about them, but also from the point of view of promoting a book. What are you finding useful? So tell us a little bit about what you've set up for yourself.
Okay, so obviously for the last several months, I've been doing Zoom with a lot of libraries and theater companies and some historical societies and Boston Public Library. I did a Zoom presentation for them. And so I feel as though I'm the Zoom queen at the moment. But what's really nice is that personal appearances are starting again. So I have three really important ones coming up. One is at the Tuitt Center for the Arts, and that's on the 13th at 4 in the afternoon. And then one is at the Cape Playhouse on the 17th, and that's at 5:30, and it's an invitation RSVP affair, but that's going to be a lovely reception and book signing. And then there is another at Highfield Hall for College Light Opera Company.
Wonderful, wonderful.
22nd. And that's also a reception for their donors and subscribers.
Nice. Okay, so I assume if people want to get in touch with you, they will go to your website or to you have one website for this book.
And right, I do.
Yes. Okay, and it's called, well, we will show this on the screen, History of Theater on Cape Cod. I'm going to say goodbye for now, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the theater.